It all started like any other quiet suburban day. The streets were lined with neat houses, trimmed lawns, and white picket fences that gave the impression of safety and order. I had just moved into the neighborhood, excited to begin a new chapter of my life in a community that promised peace and stability. Everything seemed perfect at first. The neighbors were polite, the houses immaculate, and the streets calm. But what I didn't know was that behind this perfectly manicured facade lurked an organization with rules that extended far beyond common courtesy. This organization was the Homeowners Association, and it had a very clear idea of how it thought the neighborhood should operate. At first, their rules seemed harmless, even reasonable. They regulated lawn heights, house paint colors, and the placement of trash bins. I thought, okay, these are just guidelines for keeping the community looking nice. But soon, the rules started to affect the people themselves. I noticed that visitors who came to my house, friends and family alike, were being scrutinized. There were warnings, letters slipped under doors, and in some cases, unexpected fines. I remember the first time it happened. My cousin had come over for a weekend visit. She parked in front of my house, just like any other weekend, and within a few hours, I received a stern notice from the HOA board warning me that her car was improperly parked according to their regulations. At first, I laughed. Surely they couldn't be serious. But the laughter didn't last long. The notices became more frequent, more threatening. The board started showing up in the neighborhood, inspecting houses, counting visitors, taking photos, and documenting even minor deviations from their rules. It felt like living in a surveillance state rather than a friendly suburban community. Friends began to hesitate before visiting. Conversations about coming over started with apologies, explanations, or even promises to park elsewhere. A strange tension settled over the neighborhood, and it was clear that the HOA's reach was no longer about aesthetics, it was about control. One afternoon, as I was watering my plants, one of the board members approached me. She was polite, well-dressed, smiling in a way that didn't reach her eyes. She explained that the HOA had a policy regarding guests, and that I was expected to submit a list of all expected visitors in advance. She said it was for security and community safety, but her tone left little room for refusal. My stomach sank. I realized that what had started as minor interference was escalating into an attempt to dictate my personal life, to control who I could have in my own home. I wasn't the only one affected. Soon, I learned that several neighbors had received similar notices, some more severe than others. There were complaints about people parking on the wrong side of the street, hosting barbecues without notifying the HOA, even children playing in front yards without prior approval. It was absurd. People were frightened, unsure of how to behave. The community's sense of freedom had been replaced by anxiety and obedience. And for what? A pristine neighborhood? A photo-perfect row of houses? It was a creeping authoritarianism, disguised as community management. One evening, I overheard a conversation between two other neighbors. They were whispering, voices tense, afraid someone from the board might overhear. They spoke about a family who had openly defied the HOA by hosting a large birthday party, inviting dozens of friends without filing forms or notices. The HOA had issued warnings, threatened fines, and even threatened legal action. Yet the family refused to comply. It was the first spark of resistance in a community suffocating under unnecessary rules. Curious, I began to research our HOs in depth. I found the official documents, read through the fine print, and discovered something astonishing. Many of their policies weren't backed by law, they were arbitrary guidelines, enforced selectively, often at the discretion of a few board members. They had created a system where they could target individuals who didn't fit their vision of conformity. They could enforce penalties simply because someone's lifestyle or choices didn't align with the board's perception of order. As I read more, a plan began to form. I wasn't going to sit back and let my life and the lives of my neighbors be dictated by a few overzealous officials. But I needed to be careful. The board was vigilant, always watching, always ready to escalate. I started documenting everything, every letter, every notice, every interaction with board members. I talked quietly to neighbors, building alliances, seeking out those who felt the same frustration, the same fear, and the same desire for fairness. It didn't take long to realize that I wasn't alone. The more I spoke to neighbors, the more stories emerged. Stories of families who had been warned, of friends who had been shamed, of children whose laughter had been stifled by arbitrary rules. The community, once cohesive and friendly, was fractured and fearful. But these stories also revealed the community's resilience. People wanted change. They were ready to take a stand. And that realization became the turning point. The moment when we all understood that this wasn't just about visitors or parking, it was about reclaiming our freedom and restoring trust, respect, and dignity to the neighborhood. By the end of that week, whispers turned into meetings, discussions, into planning. We began organizing quietly, strategically, so that we could challenge the HOA's overreach in a way that would protect everyone and hold the board accountable. Little did we know the actions we were about to take would not only defend our personal rights but ultimately reshape the entire community, sending a message that no arbitrary rule or board could control the lives of the people without their consent. And that's when everything changed. The first small victory would come quietly, almost imperceptibly, but it would ignite a fire that no HOA could put out. After our first discussions, the neighborhood was buzzing quietly with a mixture of fear and determination. Families were cautiously optimistic, realizing that their shared frustration could become a source of collective strength. Meetings were held in living rooms and backyards under the guise of casual gatherings, so as not to alert the HOA too early. We shared stories of letters, fines, and warnings. Each narrative added fuel to our resolve. Every neighbor had experienced the subtle, yet stifling grip of an organization that claimed authority over personal lives. It wasn't just rules, it was control, and we were all subject to its reach. Our plan started modestly. We began documenting everything meticulously. Every notice was photographed, every interaction noted with times and dates, every witness identified. It was clear that to confront the HOA effectively, we needed evidence and we needed to act smart. No one wanted a public argument that could be twisted or used against them. We needed a strategy grounded in legality and solidarity. The discussions were intense. Neighbors expressed their fears, but also their hopes. There was tension, but it was productive because everyone wanted change and everyone was ready to take small steps toward it. Soon, the HOA seemed to notice something was stirring. Letters became sterner, the tone harsher, the warnings more frequent. Some neighbors received calls that bordered on intimidation, and a few even reported that board members had appeared unannounced, inspecting properties under the pretense of community oversight. Fear was high, but it was also the moment when resolve solidified. We realized that inaction was not an option. If we didn't challenge them, they would continue to dictate who could come to our homes, who could visit our children, and even who we could trust in our own neighborhood. One pivotal incident escalated the situation dramatically. A neighbor had invited several friends for a small outdoor barbecue, entirely harmless in private. Within hours, a board member appeared at the edge of the lawn, measuring distances, inspecting fences, and handing a written warning that included vague threats of fines. The family felt humiliated. Their friends left quietly, and the children were upset. The mood in the community shifted. People began questioning the fairness of the rules openly, and whispers of legal recourse started circulating. It became clear. This wasn't a misunderstanding, it was a pattern, a deliberate attempt to assert power over every resident's personal life. Our next step was decisive. We consulted with a legal expert specializing in HOA disputes. The lawyer explained that while HOAs do have authority over certain community standards, they cannot overstep their boundaries or enforce arbitrary rules against personal freedoms. Every notice, every threat, every inspection had to be documented to establish a pattern of harassment. Armed with this advice, we began collecting testimonies from residents who had faced similar treatment. These weren't isolated incidents, they were part of a systematic approach that had slowly poisoned the community's sense of trust and freedom. As the evidence mounted, we also started organizing the neighborhood in a more formal manner. Each street had a representative, and we coordinated strategies for communication, document collection, and even safe ways to confront board members if necessary. What started as whispered frustration became a coordinated, deliberate effort. People who had once been hesitant to speak up were now sharing stories openly, rallying support, and encouraging others to stand firm. It was a remarkable transformation, fear turning into courage, isolation turning into solidarity. The HOA's reaction to our growing unity was predictable. They tried to intimidate us. Letters became legalistic, threats more formal, and attempts to divide the community were evident. Some neighbors received personalized messages suggesting that dissenters could face penalties or fines. Yet, the more they pushed, the more united we became. We held discreet meetings, created a timeline of events, and identified key violations of our rights. Each discovery strengthened our resolve. The community realized that together, we were no longer isolated individuals at the mercy of the board. We were a force, a collective voice that could not be ignored. One afternoon, a small breakthrough occurred. A longtime resident, who had been quiet until now, brought forward old documents and historical agreements that directly contradicted several of the HOA's claims. For the first time, it was clear that the HOA had been overstepping legally, using their rules to control and intimidate residents. The energy in our meetings changed dramatically. People were no longer just defending their personal freedoms. They were preparing to challenge the board in a way that could have lasting impact on the entire community. By this point, the story was no longer just about my house or my visitors. It had become a neighborhood-wide struggle. Each member of the community understood that the fight was bigger than any single family. The stakes were high, but so was the resolve. We were carefully planning our next move, knowing that it would determine not only the freedom of our visitors, but the very culture and trust within the neighborhood. The tension was palpable, the suspense high, and every small interaction could tip the balance. And then, a decisive day came, a meeting that would change the entire trajectory of our community. People gathered, evidence in hand, ready to confront the board formally. What happened during that meeting, and the consequences that followed, were nothing short of extraordinary. The HOA, confronted with clear legal evidence and the unified voice of the residents, could no longer maintain their overreaching control. This confrontation would eventually lead to reforms that restored personal freedom, rebuilt trust, and reshaped the community forever. The story of our neighborhood serves as a powerful reminder. Even when systems are designed to control, unity, documentation, and courage can turn the tide. What began as fear and intimidation ended in empowerment and a new sense of freedom. Residents learned that collective action is stronger than arbitrary authority, and that standing up for your rights can inspire change not just for you, but for an entire community. The day of the community meeting finally arrived. Residents had gathered in the small clubhouse, a mix of nervousness, determination, and anticipation filling the air. Some families arrived early, clutching folders of documents, copies of notices, letters, and photographs, while others whispered quietly, sharing last-minute details. Every person in that room understood the stakes, not just for their own household, but for the freedom of every neighbor in the community. The tension was palpable. It was a moment that would define the neighborhood's future. The HOA board arrived, confident in their authority, their posture formal, expressions carefully neutral, unaware that the residents had prepared meticulously. From the start, the atmosphere was charged. The first few minutes involved standard formalities, with the board reading a few pre-written statements about community standards and policies. But when one resident stood up with a folder in hand and began detailing specific instances of harassment, the mood shifted. Document after document, testimony after testimony, the narrative painted a starkly different picture than the board had intended. It became evident to everyone in the room, even the most loyal board members, that the residents had undeniable evidence of overreach and intimidation. One by one, neighbors recounted their experiences. A family shared how their child had been told to stay off their front lawn during playtime. Another resident described letters threatening fines for minor guests or informal visits. The mother of a young boy explained the emotional stress her family endured because of arbitrary inspections. The stories were raw, emotional, and real, creating a mounting weight of accountability that the board could not ignore. Each story added another layer to the evidence, and the room was buzzing with quiet murmurs of support and shock. Even some board members exchanged uneasy glances, realizing that they had underestimated the residents. Unity and determination. The turning point came when one long-standing resident presented historical documents that directly contradicted several claims the HOA had been making. Original community agreements, signed decades ago, clearly outlined the rights of homeowners regarding visitors, parking, and property use. The board tried to interject, to argue, but the evidence was irrefutable. The room went silent as the weight of the truth settled in. Residents nodded, some wiping away tears of relief, others whispering affirmations to their neighbors. It was a vindication for everyone who had felt powerless under the board's arbitrary rules. As discussions continued, the atmosphere shifted from confrontation to resolution. The board, confronted with irrefutable evidence, began to acknowledge their errors, though some resistance remained. Legal advisors clarified the limits of HOA authority and the consequences of past overreach. By the end of the meeting, agreements were drafted. The arbitrary rules concerning visitors would be suspended. Enforcement protocols would be revised, and a transparent system would be implemented for any future disputes. Most importantly, the residents had established a precedent. Collective action, backed by documentation and courage, could protect the rights of every family in the neighborhood. Outside the clubhouse, the community felt transformed. Neighbors hugged, exchanged stories, and celebrated quietly but wholeheartedly. The tension that had gripped the streets, the fear that had shadowed each visit and each gathering, began to dissipate. Children could play freely again, friends could visit without hesitation, and families felt safe in their own homes. It was a new beginning, one where the community had reclaimed not just its autonomy, but also its trust and solidarity. Over the following weeks, the changes became tangible. The streets felt lighter, the laughter of children returned, and casual gatherings were no longer a source of anxiety. Residents took pride in their homes again, but more importantly, in their community. They knew that their unity had created a lasting impact, not only correcting past wrongs but also safeguarding the neighborhood for future generations. The HOA, now under increased oversight and transparency, had to operate within clear legal limits. Arbitrary intimidation was no longer acceptable, and the culture of fear had been replaced by mutual respect and accountability. Reflecting on these events, it became clear how critical community involvement and vigilance are in maintaining personal freedom. It's easy to assume that rules are always fair, but unchecked authority can quickly shift from guidance to control. Our neighborhood learned that the voice of the people, when united and well-prepared, can challenge and change even the most rigid systems. Every resident who had felt silenced or powerless became a part of a broader story about courage, resilience, and the power of collective action. Looking back, it's incredible to see how one seemingly small issue, control over visitors, sparked a movement that reshaped an entire community. What began as fear, anxiety, and quiet rebellion grew into a coordinated effort, legal challenge, and ultimately triumph. Families learned the importance of standing together, documenting injustices, and taking decisive action when rights are being infringed. The neighborhood emerged stronger, more connected, and more vigilant than ever before. The story of our community is more than just an HOA dispute. It's a lesson in courage, unity, and the necessity of protecting personal freedoms. It's a reminder that even in the face of intimidation, careful planning, communication, and persistence can lead to meaningful change. Our experiences show that while rules can guide, they must never control the spirit or freedoms of a community. And most importantly, it demonstrates that when neighbors stand together, they can transform fear into empowerment and injustice into lasting reform. By the end, The residents understood that they had done more than win a legal or procedural victory. They had redefined their community culture, ensuring that respect, fairness, and personal freedom would be at the heart of their neighborhood forever. What started as a battle over visitors ended as a story of resilience, empowerment, and collective triumph that would inspire generations to come.